Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Professor Paul Sabin, Associate Professor of History. His research and teaching focus on energy and environmental history. Today we'll talk with Professor Sabin about his new book, The Bet, Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon, and Our Gamble Over Earth's Future. It provides a framework for understanding today's environmental debates. Welcome, Professor Sabin.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with an overview of the book and, of course, tell us the story about the bet.
Sure. Well, the book uses an iconic bet between the biologist Paul Ehrlich, who is the author of the 1968 blockbuster The Population Bomb, and one of his main critics, a man named Julian Simon, an economist. And they actually made a bet in 1980 about 5 metals and their prices and whether they would go up or down over the course of the next 10 years. And this was a proxy for their arguments about overpopulation and whether the world was headed for famine, resource scarcity, thermonuclear war, or disease outbreaks. And these have been some of the predictions that Ehrlich had made. Mm-hmm. And Simon had argued, in fact, that human ingenuity and innovation would lead to overpopulation or population growth not being ultimately a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So who won the bet?
So, spoiler alert, Simon won the bet, and ever since people have been arguing about what the outcome of the bet means. So the 5 metals, they were copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten, and they declined pretty much across the board. Ehrlich ultimately sent Simon a check for $576 to represent the decline in value of the bundle of metals that they had bet on. And so the question is, what does this bet mean? I mean, right. Metal prices aren't necessarily the best proxy for the state of humanity or the environmental conditions.
I was curious as to why they chose metals. I mean, what is the relevancy of that?
Right. Well, I mean, if you situate in the late 1970s and think about the run-up in oil prices and the oil shocks at that time, and there also was a significant increase in prices of metals at that time, so there was a lot of focus on commodities and commodity prices and the idea that we were headed towards scarcity. So there have been predictions in the early 70s that we were going to run out of oil during the 1980s, and that turned out not to be the case. So the part of why I was interested in this story, coming at it from an environmental history perspective, was that Simon won the bet and trying to understand, what can we learn from his victory over Ehrlich in this case.
Right. I mean, just to expound on what led you to write the book. I mean, so is this bet well known?
It has become.
How did you get here?
Well, it has become a significant touchstone, particularly for conservatives criticizing environmentalists over environmental regulation. Actually, the Competitive Enterprise Institute offers an award each year, the Julian Simon Award for innovators, for people who focus on human innovation, and the award trophy is a leaf that has the 5 metals that were from the bet. So I guess it's sort of symbolic of how Simon's victory has been a touchstone. And so it's seen that that these predictions of population growth were perhaps mistaken, then that also means that various other kinds of environmental concerns also maybe are mistaken. That's been the argument.
Right. You must, in terms of writing this book, looked back and have seen some predictions back in the day that were made that didn't necessarily pan out. Right. Was there anything that was particularly surprising to you?
Well, I was surprised to see how widely held some of these predictions were about that we were going to run out of oil, or in the late 60s, there's tremendous fears of worldwide famine that was about to strike the planet. And then some of the claims that were made based on that also were striking. There was a book that was published in the late 60s called Famine 1975 that argued that there was going to be worldwide famines as a result of overpopulation and food shortages, and therefore we should practice triage. And some countries were seen as being kind of beyond the pale, unsavable, and that we should cut them off from food aid. And so some of the arguments were pretty extreme in terms of what we needed to do to avoid the future crises.
It must have been somewhat amusing too to have read some of them, I would imagine.
Well, it is interesting to see these predictions and how they haven't turned out as expected. I mean, so my book is called The Bet because of this little bet, but it's also another meaning of the title is that we're all engaged in a bet today about the future, and so some of these predictions haven't come true to date, but it doesn't mean that difficult times or major challenges won't face us in the future.
Right,
so I guess
right.
many of these issues aren't entirely resolved.
So what do we face in the future?
Well, I'm most interested in the debate over climate change right now and seeing how that's unfolding. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this earlier story about population growth and resource scarcity is how the debate today over climate change is kind of stuck in ruts that were established by the earlier fight between Simon and Ehrlich and their allies. And so you see today accusations of alarmism on one side and great skepticism about science by many conservatives, and part of that is drawn from their previous criticisms about population growth and resource scarcity. Now, those things didn't turn out the way that was expected, but I think climate change, in fact, is happening and is a grave concern, and it's really unfortunate that we're stuck in these long-standing ruts.
Yeah, I mean, I have read that pretty much most scientists will agree that there is climate change going on, that
Yes,
it is happening.
definitely.
So do you argue in your book something along the lines of how to, what we need to do?
Well, I mean, the argument of the book is one that we need to recognize how these two extreme perspectives in some ways produced each other, and that also we need to figure out what can we learn from both sides. So I guess I see that both Ehrlich's perspective and Simon's arguments have important insights to share.
And what are they? Yes.
So Ehrlich's on the way that humans are transforming the planet, the tremendous impact that we have, many of the biological changes that are unfolding. But Simon's about the adaptability of human society, the flexibility of human economies, the role of innovation and technology and science, all of those things that mean that we aren't on a straight line, I guess, from abundance to scarcity, as many people who were predicting we were going to run out of various resources. They said we were going to go, from abundant oil all of a sudden to scarcity, but in fact, it's really a history of boom and bust over the whole history of the oil economy, and so I guess learning from both sides, I think that's one of the essential points. In terms of learning from Julian Simon's point of view, he argued that problems often led to solutions that ultimately led us better off. And my own view about the climate story is that it's only by recognizing that climate change is a problem that we can unleash the solutions that Julian Simon celebrated. And so one of the problems that we face right now is that in the reluctance to recognize that climate change is a problem, many of Simon's intellectual allies are in some ways undermining the very kinds of solutions that Simon celebrated.
Well, couldn't one argue that there are certain people who recognize that there's climate change, but the people who don't want to recognize it have a financial gain? So that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Well, it is true that there are powerful financial interests actually on all sides of this story. But my book is more about the intellectual battle and recognizing actually that there are important insights on both sides. It's not just a financial fight. I mean, that is very important. The oil, fossil fuel industries are very powerful and have deep vested interest in sustaining the fossil fuel economy. But at the same time, the whole debate is actually embedded in this larger clash over how we think about the future.
Okay. So how do you think we should think about the future?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic about the future, recognizing that we have major challenges ahead, but that I think if we take the steps necessary to address them, we can overcome them. And with the case of climate change, the major steps would be bringing climate into the marketplace, actually, to the extent through carbon taxes or through kind of regulatory systems like cap and trade, but that there be some way to put the power of human innovation and markets to bear on the carbon dioxide, the climate problem. And that really what the problem we have right now is that it's sort of free-floating outside of the marketplace, and there's no way to bring the powerful forces we have to bear on solving it.
I wonder, is there going to be a point of no return where everyone keeps talking and not doing anything, and then it becomes too late? And then I think about population being at 7 billion now. I mean, how many more people can the Earth carry?
Right. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that there's really a distinction between population growth and climate change are somewhat different, because climate change produces environmental outcomes, rising sea levels, acidification of the ocean. They're very, it's likely linked to more extreme weather. There are specific things that come, whereas I think population growth is kind of results in the kind of different kinds of diffuse pressures that are felt by the marketplace. And so there are many different ways to solve the problems that are the challenges that population growth poses. So I don't think that we're going to run to the point where one more person or a certain number of people are going to lead us over the cliff on population.
Okay.
But I think in climate, actually, it is more, that's a little less clear in terms of how that's going to unfold. And there are possibly tipping points with the climate, and we don't entirely understand the climate system and how it will develop. And so those are the kinds of risks and uncertainties that the kind of bet that we're making right now that we need to address.
So how do we address it? I mean, what's the first step?
Well, like as I was saying, I think it's really about putting a price on carbon, on trying to bring the problems associated with global warming into a market framework where we can be bringing the kind of forces to bear on solving them. That the kind of innovation that Julian Simon celebrated will only happen if we can create the proper incentives for people to be innovating and taking action. So I think it's really about a partnership between government and the marketplace, and that the marketplace needs to be structured in a way that it kind of furthers the values that we have about the kind of society we want to live in.
Well, hopefully that will happen sooner rather than
I
later.
I hope so. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but there are a lot of reasons not to be, too.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thanks so much for having me.
For more information about Professor Sabin and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.